We'll see what cottage internet can do for us. Share the links and things. Hydrate. I am hydrating with water. Michael is hydrating with beer. I hope you're hydrating with something, preferably water, but do what you gotta do to get through the apocalypse. Like I always say. I'm not on my own laptop right now because it got forgotten. So, excuse me while I... This is why we're starting early tonight. Don't make me verify a login code. I get it. Twitch just wants to make sure it's me. But come on now. Come on. It's me, I promise. Hello? It is me you're looking for? There we go, alright. Apologies for the terrible video quality tonight. But you know what? It be like that sometimes. Sometimes you've got to stream from not the best internet available in the entire world. And it's fine. It's fine. It's fine. All right. Can anyone guess what book we're doing tonight? I suppose while I wait for the internet to get its stuff together, I can open my little unboxing. This is my present to myself, as it was. I ordered it and was like, this is gonna be a birthday present, so I haven't even opened the box. Indigo. The place of dreams. I miss going to Indigo so much. From, oh my goodness, Peter Popper Press. It's The Tree of Dreams. Oh my goodness. I knew it was going to be sparkly, but I didn't realize it was going to be textured as well. And it's got gold leaf papers, which I also didn't expect. It's very, very exciting. Ah, that's awesome. All right. We have tweeted. Nope. We have tweeted. There we go. We have Facebook. Okay. We are ready to go. We are ready and raring to go. Welcome to A Book at Bedtime, Storyranger Presents production. Tonight we are going to read from the Hardy Boys Detective Handbook by Franklin W. Dixon in consultation with Special Agent William F. Flynn, Federal Bureau of Investigation, retired. Revised edition. Chapter 1. Mystery of the Vanishing Plastics. Undercover work. Boys, I've taken on an important investigation for the Domus Plastics Company of Dover. I think you can help me. Fenton Hardy, the famous private detective, sat behind the mahogany desk in his study and looked across at 18-year-old Frank and his brother Joe, who was a year younger. How, Dad? Dark-haired Frank asked eagerly. I'm convinced, Mr. Hardy went on, that this case can only be solved by undercover work. Since you're on vacation, how would you like to be my assistants? Try and stop us, Joe said with a grin. We were hoping something exciting would turn up this summer, said Frank. The boys were pleased that their father had so much faith in their detective ability. Mr. Hardy had trained his sons thoroughly in police science, and they'd become very proficient investigators. When do we start? Frank asked. I've already laid the plans, his father replied. Listen to them carefully. As of tomorrow, you'll be known as Frank and Joe Gent, and you'll be given credentials for those names. Whoa! Cover names and all, Frank exclaimed. You'll go to the employment office of the Domus Plastics Company, Mr. Hardy continued, and you'll be given jobs in their packing department. I've reserved accommodations for all of us in a rooming house in Dover. We'll have adjoining rooms. Will you be working undercover too, Dad? Joe asked. Yes, I'm Jerry Gent, your uncle. I'll be employed in the shipping room. Exactly what are we supposed to look for, Dad? Frank inquired. I'm coming to that. Domus is a fairly large company. They make household articles and some rather expensive decorative items. Past inventories have shown small losses in finished goods, probably due to pilferage by employees. This last inventory, however, showed a staggering loss. Besides this, 2 molds, which cost the company $10,000 apiece, have been stolen. Dad, interjected Joe, why do you want us in the packing department? Mr. Hardy studied a sheaf of notes. I've a feeling that's where the action starts. A lot of Domus products, packaged as usual, are being sold all over the States under the guise of a special sale for less than the listed price. Who sells them? Frank asked. They are offered by telephone and delivered COD, cash on delivery by various truck drivers. The physical descriptions of the men are not very conclusive. About those molds, Joe spoke up. Are there any clues to them? Yes. 2 rival plastics companies have informed the president of Domus, Mr. Albert Matt, that they were approached by an unknown man over the telephone. He offered to sell the molds for $5,000 each. I have communicated with every plastics manufacturer who makes products similar to the Domus line and asked them to notify Mr. Matt in case they are contacted by anyone offering to sell the molds. All these companies have agreed to cooperate. Who else knows about our role in the operation? Frank asked. Only Mr. Matt, George Sard, who is the plant manager, and Captain Nast of the Dover Detective Bureau. Mr. Hardy leaned forward to emphasize his next point. Tomorrow morning, report to your work clothes to Mr. Sard. He'll be expecting you and place each of you in one of the 2 packing rooms. From there, you'll be on your own. Keep your eyes and ears open and make a mental note of everything. Follow all the rules of undercover work and you should have no trouble. The boys nodded. We'll meet at night, Mr. Hardy went on, and compare notes. Is it all clear? So far, yes, Joe replied. We're to discover how the merchandise is disappearing and who is stealing it. Exactly, son. And, Frank put in, we must find out where the plastics molds are. It seems to me that whoever is stealing the merchandise is also involved in the theft of the molds. That was my deduction, too, Mr. Hardy said. Have you checked the background of all the personnel in the plant, Dad? Joe asked. The Dover police did. They investigated everyone from the president down to the porters, but since all the members of the police department are likely to be known to the thieves, I was called in to do the undercover work. Mr. Hardy paused, then went on. Domus needs few skilled workers. They've been hiring a number of unskilled employees. Most of the routine jobs are done by them. The key workers are older, skilled machinists who make the molds and work the presses. Then there are about 20 younger men, mostly unskilled. They do the heavy work, including packing and shipping. It's in the last group that 4 have criminal records, Mr. Hardy continued. At this point, every employee is a suspect, but I think these 4 deserve special attention. Have a look. He handed his son 4 dossiers. Frank and Joe examined the material as carefully as if studying for a final exam. They memorized the men's outstanding physical characteristics and inspected their criminal records minutely. Finally, they placed the folders before their father. Well, Mr. Hardy said with a smile, let's see what you've learned about these characters. Which one served a sentence in Sing Sing? Alex Smathers, the boys replied simultaneously. Joe, the detective went on, tell me all you can remember about him. Joe took a deep breath. Smathers has the worst criminal record of all. He was born in Brooklyn, is 5 feet 4 inches tall, weighs 145 pounds, gray eyes, large nose, wavy brown hair, dresses flashily, is a bachelor and likes to gamble. He is a fast talker, has small, close-set eyes, good teeth, seldom smiles, moves, and walks quickly. He'll be easy to recognize, Dad. Joe? Frank, has Joe left anything out? He forgot the age, which was 37. Smathers' long record shows convictions for assault and battery, grand larceny, burglary, and embezzlement. I knew that. I just forgot to mention it, Joe said sheepishly. Mr. Hardy nodded, then said to Frank, tell us what you've learned about Sam Streeter. He's 30 years old, 5 feet 11 inches tall, weighs 190 pounds, was born in Cleveland. He has spent most of his life in New York. He has brown eyes, low forehead, black hair, big mouth, large protruding ears, square jaw, poor teeth, and moves slowly. Frank hesitated a moment. Oh, yes, he has a poor educational background, is not very intelligent, dresses in work clothes or sports clothes, and is not married. He has a long record of convictions for grand larceny. I guess that's about all. Have you anything to add? Mr. Hardy asked Joe. Only that Streeter smokes cigars. He seems to have one in his mouth at all times and chews on it. Let's go on from there, said Mr. Hardy, obviously pleased. Frank, tell us about Harry Rands. Rands is 22. He was born in New York City, is single, has a long juvenile record for assault and battery, purse snatchings, burglary, and larceny, has 2 convictions as an adult for auto theft and grand larceny. It also seems he will resort to violence at the slightest provocation, mainly because he is strong and muscular. He is 5 feet 10 inches tall, weighs 180 pounds, has brown eyes, brown wavy hair, fair complexion. Rands graduated from high school. He has a nervous habit of cracking his fingers and laughs loudly at the smallest jokes. And that's all that's important, I think. How about the last character? Inquired Mr. Hardy, looking at Joe quizzically. His name is Edward Cowell, and his nickname is Slick. A convicted thief, he is 23 years old, about 5 feet 6 inches, weighs 140 pounds, has long black hair, brown eyes, and a small flat nose. Cowell blinks his eyes continually. He's always sarcastic and ready with a wisecrack. Very good, said Mr. Hardy. Now let's review the rules about undercover work. Joe, you begin. Okay. An undercover operator is one who changes his character so that he can associate with criminals and obtain information necessary to an investigation and... You mean he's a good actor? Interjected Frank. That's right, his father nodded. As I was saying before, I was interrupted. Joe continued with a smile. An undercover operator must be intelligent and possess initiative. He should be courageous and cool at all times. Very good, Mr. Hardy said. Now, Frank, since you seem so eager to get into this act, tell us something about the preparations for an undercover agent. That's easy. First, he must know exactly what information he's looking for. Next, he learns the best character to assume under the circumstances and plays that role so well he actually becomes the character. He must dress the part and use the kind of speech expected from him. He learns to anticipate every possible question that he may be asked and gives predetermined answers whenever possible. How's that? Frank, you forgot a couple of things, Joe stated. An agent working undercover must never carry any incriminating papers, letters, badges, or other articles that may reveal his true identity. He makes it his business to create situations where he may meet, talk to, and become familiar with those persons from whom he is seeking information. In the Domas case, he'll probably be working with them and eating at the same places, right, Dad? Correct. Now, what have we left out? Communications with headquarters, Frank replied, but the reason I didn't bring it up is that we won't have that problem. You'll be there at the same rooming house with us. Let's review it anyway, in the event that our plans should change, said the detective. Okay, here goes, Frank volunteered. Every agent must communicate with headquarters or another agent acting as a go-between. He must memorize all telephone numbers he might have to call or addresses he may have to write to. He can't take the chance and carry written telephone numbers or addresses around. If he has an appointment to meet another agent, he must choose the location carefully and exercise caution going to and from it. If he is followed, that means failure. Mr. Hardy added solemnly, the revelation that an agent is working undercover has sometimes meant his death. So, boys, be careful. Here are identification papers made out in your new names. We will try to stick as close to the true story of your lives as possible. You were both born in Bayport and attended school here. Your father died when you were young. The reason you came to work for Domas was because you have been thrown out of school after being in trouble with the police many times.
Open all the doors. Open all the windows.
What kind of trouble? Interrupted Frank. Well, let's not make you too bad, replied Mr. Hardy with a grin. Just a few arrests for burglary, purse snatching, and a car theft. That's a typical juvenile delinquency pattern.
Yeah.
Wow, exclaimed Frank, looking at Joe. We sure are a couple of hoods. Next day, the young detectives presented themselves at the Domas Plastics Company and were immediately hired. Joe was to work in packing room designated as number 1, and Frank in number 2. The first day was uneventful, marked by a little conversation between themselves and their coworkers. Both realized that they were the subject of stares of curiosity by their colleagues. That night, the three Hardys met in the detectives' room to review their activities. I'm certain you didn't learn much today, Mr. Hardy said. That's to be expected, but I hope you've been thinking about the possible ways in which these thefts are being made. Joe and I talked about it after work, Frank said. We cased the layout. Both packing rooms are alike except in size. No one but employees of the packing and shipping departments are allowed to enter. So far, we have no idea who steals the stuff and how. Seems like a tough case, Dad. The detective looked at his son severely. You're forgetting your role. Call me Uncle Jerry at all times. Sorry, Uncle Jerry. Joe said, I recognize Harry Rands. He works in my packing room and looks like a mean customer. All the workers seem to be afraid of him. Cowell is in my packing room, Frank said, and the nickname Slick fits him like a glove. He talks to everybody in the place and moves around quickly. Smathers and Streeter are in the shipping department with me, Mr. Hardy added. Frank stood up and paced around the room. Joe and I went to the luncheonette down the street at noon, he said. Smathers and Streeter came in. They started to play the pinball machine. Rands and Cowell joined them. They were playing for money on high scores. Yes, said Joe. And who do you think was winning most of the time? Slick? Right. By the way, Uncle Jerry, Frank said, they looked our way a few times, probably talking about us. Don't worry about their curiosity, said Mr. Hardy, but avoid becoming self-conscious and betraying yourselves. The boys nodded. Joe suddenly exclaimed, I've got it! A good way to meet those guys would be to get to the luncheonette early and start playing the pinball machine while we eat our sandwiches. Maybe they'll offer to play with us. An excellent idea, Mr. Hardy said approvingly, but don't overact your parts. Next evening, the three gathered again. The detective sat down in a comfortable chair, and the boys lounged on his bed, looking glum. What happened today? Mr. Hardy began. Nothing on my end, Joe replied. I made a little progress, Frank said. Cowell spoke to me a few times, asked where I was from and things like that, but I made believe I wasn't too eager to talk. Good. Now, don't be so disappointed. You can't make much progress in a day or two. We can't spend months either, Joe said. We have to go back to school. Mr. Hardy laughed. Don't worry. I believe we'll get a break sooner than you think. By the way, what happened to the pinball machine idea? Frank looked crestfallen. I stopped to wash when the lunch hour whistle blew, and when I reached the outside and met Joe, he told me that our friends had already gone into the luncheonette. I guess they didn't stop to clean up. The moral of the story is, don't be too clean. I suggest you go to lunch promptly tomorrow. Next evening, Joe started the conversation. Nothing important happened today, except we did beat them to the pinball machine. When they filed in and saw us playing, our suspects gave us black glances and whispered amongst themselves, but none of them offered to play with us. That's right, said Frank, and I noticed that Cowell was staring at me all afternoon. I wonder if he's suspicious. It probably means, Mr. Hardy replied, that he's become interested in you and is observing you closely. Sooner or later you'll get a break, provided you're careful. Uncle Jerry, I noticed one thing that may be important, said Joe. A man came into the luncheonette and ate with our suspects. He also walked into the packing room 3 times during the afternoon and spoke with Mr. Cowell. One of the girls told me that he's Clarence Sard, the manager's brother, who's in charge of quality control. Mr. Hardy's eyebrows arched. They could have been discussing business, but it's a little odd that he would have lunch with the Packers. Usually the Sards eat at the pub. I'll check this angle out tomorrow. The next 2 days, Frank and Joe both drew a blank, and so did Mr. Hardy, but at the beginning of the second week, all were smiling when they met in the detective's room. Joe spoke first. Believe it or not, Rand's talked to me a couple times today. He seemed friendly. And Cowell was buddy-buddy with me, said Frank. He made it his business to work near me as much as possible. At lunch, he and I played pinball for a while, and then Joe and Rand joined us. We played for a nickel a game, and Cowell won almost every time. He surely knows how to manipulate that machine. I can't understand what made them so friendly, Joe remarked. Mr. Hardy grinned. I might have been responsible for that. I told a couple of gossipy fellows confidentially that you boys had been in trouble with the police and had served a term in reform school. Evidently, the news has reached your friends. Frank said soberly, There's one thing that bothers me. Smathers and Streeter never came over to the pinball machine. The reason, Mr. Hardy replied, is probably because they are older and more suspicious. It will take them a while longer to accept you. Now, both of you go take a walk, then go to bed. I have some thinking to do. The next evening, Frank was leaving the plant when Cowell called to him. Wait, Frank. The man sidled up and whispered, What have you got in your pockets? Defiantly, the boy answered, None of your business. I saw you take those ashtrays, Cowell said, but I won't squeal. What are you going to do with them? Frank glanced left and right, and then said, I'm going to sell them. I spent all my money over the weekend and I'm broke. Nervously, he added. You're not going to report me, are you? Nah, but that's only petty larceny stuff. You ought to get into the big money. I'm game, Frank said, but where are you going to find big-time stuff in this joint? Cowell looked thoughtful, as if he had said too much. I'm just kidding, he muttered. Forget it. I'll see you tomorrow. Frank waited outside the plant for Joe and told him of the conversation. Then they headed for the rooming house and went directly to their father's room. The detective arrived minutes later, and Frank relayed the information. That was fast thinking, Mr. Hardy said. I made sure Cowell saw me put the stuff into my pockets, Frank remarked. Joe grinned. That's how you make friends with thieves. Seems we're headed for action. Good, Mr. Hardy said, and added, Domas has been manufacturing some new products. In a week or so, they should be ready for shipment. Unless we can crack this case before then, the company will begin to lose a large amount of merchandise right away. Uncle Jerry, you've been working closer to Streeter and Smathers, Joe said. How have they been acting lately? At first, they were aloof and suspicious, but the past few days they've been more friendly. Even asked about you boys. No kidding, Frank said. Cowell quizzes me about you, too. They're comparing our answers. This shows, Mr. Hardy said emphatically, that you can't be too careful about what you say. The 3 sat up late, mapping their strategy. It was agreed that if any move occurred, it would have to be through the initiative of the suspects. Frank would continue pilfering plastics, and Joe would begin the next day. The friendly relations among Frank, Joe, Cowell, and Rands grew during the rest of the week. They played the pinball machine at lunch and were joined by Streeter and Smathers. On Friday, as Frank and Cowell were walking to the luncheonette, Frank said nervously, "Can you loan me a couple bucks? I'm broke." Laughing, Cowell pulled a wad of money from his pocket. He picked out a bill and handed it to Frank in a grand manner. "Here's a 10. Pay me when you're on the plush." "Slick," Frank said in admiration. "That's quite a roll. You make that much money?" Cowell chuckled. "You kidding? Nobody makes anything in this cheap outfit." He glanced around cautiously, then whispered, "Maybe I can let you in on something. Where do you live?" Frank told him, and then they were joined by Joe and Rands, and the conversation ended. As the Hardys conferred in the boys' room that evening, a knock sounded on the door. Cowell and Rands walked in. "Hi, fellows," Cowell greeted. "Hi, Mr. Gent. You must be keeping an eye on your nephews, huh?" Mr. Hardy grinned. "They can pretty much take care of themselves." A general conversation followed, and Mr. Hardy noted that both Rands and Cowell moved about the room casually, taking everything in. Then, apparently satisfied, Cowell suggested that Frank and Joe take a walk with him and Rands. It was late when the boys returned, but their father had waited up for them. "Uncle Jerry," Frank said, "they took us to a recreation hall where Smathers and Streeter were playing pool. A little later, Clarence Sard came in. All of them seemed to be sizing us up." "They asked a lot of questions," Joe added. "I think Sard's is part of their group." "You're probably right," Mr. Hardy said slowly, as if he was deliberating. "It wouldn't surprise me if he were the ringleader, even though his brother is the plant manager. I'd better watch him carefully." He yawned. "Let's get some sleep." On Monday, as Frank and Cowell were returning to the packing room after lunch, the latter stopped and half whispered to Frank, "How would you like to make some easy money?" Frank appeared surprised. "I'll do anything within reason. Only whatever I do, Joe comes in with me. But my uncle must be kept in the dark." "Suits me," rejoined Cowell. "I'll let you know when it's okay." The following afternoon, Cowell told Frank to bring Joe to the recreation hall at 7 that night. When they arrived, Cowell was waiting for them in the doorway. He led them into a back room where they found Rand, Streeter, Smathers, and Clarence Sard seated around a table. "Okay, fellows," Cowell said. "Sit down." Smathers opened the conversation. "Slick says you want to throw in with us, yeah?" Frank nodded, while Joe responded with pretended enthusiasm. "Sure, if we get a fair cut." Streeter said belligerently, "We're letting you kids in on this, but you better keep your mouth shut. Until now, everything has been going along fine, and we expect it to stay that way, but..." Cowell interrupted. "Take it easy, Sam. These boys are okay. Now let's get down to business." Joe said quietly, "Frank and I have been around. You don't have to worry about us, but if you don't trust us, we'll forget about the whole deal. Let's go, Frank." He rose from the chair. Wait a minute," Smathers cut in. "Let's stop acting like kids. Sit down, Joe." Sard cleared his throat and began. "It's an easy racket. There's no trouble at all. This is how it goes. The girls in the office make out labels addressed to the dealers who are to receive the merchandise. The labels go to the packing rooms together with instructions of what is to be sent. The stuff is packed, the labels glued onto the cartons, and then the shipping department takes care of the loading. The company uses outside truckers to make deliveries. Follow me?" "Sure, so far," replied Frank. "But I don't see how we come in on it." Everyone but Joe laughed, and Sard continued. "Here's how. We have labels of our own, which I lifted when I had the chance. We type the address of an old warehouse on them with a typewriter we bought at a pawn shop. Harry and Slick pack whatever we need and put those labels on the extra packages. Then they're trucked to the warehouse by drivers who work with us." "Pretty clever scheme," Frank put in. "You bet," Cowell said. "In the warehouse, we sort out the stuff, then pack the goods we've sold to our dealers and arrange for delivery." Frank and Joe gave an approving nod, and Cowell added, "We only take what we have a market for. Smart, eh?" "It's real slick, said Joe. There was a murmur of approval at Joe's play on words. Then Sard continued, "Domas is bringing out a new line which will be shipped soon. We're going to cash in on this, and big, too. We'll take a truckload in the morning and another this afternoon." "Won't that look funny?" queried Joe. "I mean, doesn't it seem peculiar just loading stuff up for our warehouse?" Sam Streeter snorted. "Do you think we're that dumb? There's legitimate orders on those trucks, too." "I guess you guys have thought of everything," remarked Joe. "We're sure glad we're in with you," Frank added. Clarence Sard nodded. "We can use some more help."
He took an envelope from his inside pocket and doled out the labels to Frank, Harry, Joe, and Slick, and told them what products to pack and how many of each. Then the boys left, impatient to see Fenton Hardy. When they arrived at the rooming house, the young detectives reported the latest developments to their father. They exhibited the labels. Mr. Hardy made a mental note of the address. He looked at his sons and quietly said, "You did a great job. Keep on, but don't take any unnecessary chances. The case is as good as solved." Frank and Joe nodded. "I'm going to notify Captain Nast. He'll be ready for the showdown. Now, go to bed and relax." For the next few days, the boys followed orders of the gang. Monday night after work, there was a knock on the door of their room. Cowell walked in and invited them to take a stroll. They agreed, calling to their uncle that they were going out with Slick. Outside, Cowell beckoned them to his car and slid behind the wheel. "Where are we going?" Frank asked. "To the warehouse," replied Slick. "Now that you're in with us, you're going to work." "We don't mind," Frank said. "It's better than sitting in our room watching TV and hearing Uncle Jerry snoring." "You'll see a swell setup," Cowell said as they stopped in front of a dilapidated warehouse. It was located in the waterfront section of the city. They got out, and Cowell gave 3 sharp raps on the door, paused, then rapped once. The door opened, and the boys found themselves in a large, dimly lighted room crammed with Domus packages. Streeter and Rands were moving them around, sorting them by products. Smathers had a list in his hands and was calling out the articles needed. Clarence Sard sat at the table, pecking away laboriously on a typewriter. He was preparing a new set of labels with the addresses of the dealers. Frank noted a padlocked closet in one of the rooms. Frank noticed a padlocked closet in one corner of the room. "What's in there?" he asked Cowell, pointing. "None of your business," was the curt reply. Smathers looked up and growled, "It's about time you guys pitched in. Come over here and stack up these boxes like I tell you." The boys joined in with alacrity and made up various piles at Smathers' direction. From time to time, Clarence Sard mumbled and swore, remarking that the typewriter was defective. The men's bantering about his typing ability increased his anger. Finally, Frank said, "Will you let me try? I used to work in the office at the reform school and learned to type a little." Sard accepted the offer. He showed Frank the names and addresses of the dealers to be typed on the labels and watched him work. Frank was careful not to type too well. About 10 o'clock, Sard announced that enough work had been completed for the evening. They stood around and talked a while. Finally, Smathers said, "Clarence has made contacts to dispose of this stuff at a good price. We'll hire 2 trucks day after tomorrow to make the deliveries. Everybody be ready to report here to load them." He cleared his throat and went on. "Clarence has also made arrangements to sell those molds we have. We can't get the price we wanted, but we better get rid of them. They're too hot." Streeter exulted. "Looks like we're in for a good piece of change." The group broke up, and Slick drove the boys back to their rooming house. Frank and Joe reported to their father everything that had happened. They described the warehouse minutely, including the type of locks on the doors, the padlock on the closet, and the location of the light switch on the wall. When they mentioned the prospective sale of the molds, Mr. Hardy laughed quietly and said, "I arranged that. Right after Clarence Sard contacted the Phoenix Plastics Company, I was notified. I requested that they negotiate with him, and they have done so." The detective went on, "I'm going to go out and meet Captain Nast to inform him of the latest developments. He'll keep a sharp watch on the warehouse until we're ready to close in." The next evening, the Hardys were again picked up by Cowell. They went to the warehouse and continued their work as on the previous night. They noticed, however, that Clarence Sard was not present. Smathers grumbled, "I wonder what's keeping him. He should have been here half an hour ago, and he's got the list of purchasers on him." At that instant, a key turned in the lock. Clarence Sard entered and slammed the door angrily behind him. His eyes had a wild look. "Where have you been?" Smathers demanded. "We'll never get these shipments ready for tomorrow now." "Where have I been?" Sard shouted. "At my brother's house." He pointed to Frank and Joe. "I found out that these kids are stool pigeons and are working for their father, Detective Fenton Hardy, who is posing as their uncle." The men glared at the boys in fury. Smathers pulled out a switchblade knife and advanced towards the Hardys menacingly. There were shouts and curses from other members of the gang. Instantly, Frank and Joe separated slightly and retreated. Frank headed towards the door, with Joe a few feet away from him. Suddenly, Frank reached up and snapped off the light switch. Pandemonium broke loose in the darkness, with the thieves striking out wildly in utter confusion. There were groans of pain as they mistakenly mauled one another. Suddenly there was a loud pounding on the door, and a voice called out, "This is Captain Mast. I have a search warrant." The door was flung open, and in stormed the captain, a flashlight in one hand and a pistol in the other. "Stop where you are," he commanded. Right behind him was Mr. Hardy and a detective. Frank switched on the light. Smathers dropped the knife on the concrete floor. "Raise your hands above your heads and face the wall," Captain Nast ordered. "You're all under arrest." He turned to Clarence Sard and served the search warrant. Then he directed the detective to frisk the thieves. All incriminating papers were taken from them. Within minutes, 4 uniformed officers were on the scene. The prisoners were handcuffed and taken to jail. Mr. Hardy telephoned Albert Matt, president of the Domas Plastics Company, and the plant manager, George Sard. Both came to the warehouse. They were amazed at the amount of merchandise stored there and identified it as having been manufactured in their plant. Fenton Hardy walked over to the closet. He looked at the padlock, selected a key from a case of master keys, and opened the door. In it were 2 plastic molds. Mr. Matt confirmed that they were the ones stolen from Domas. All this while, Frank and Joe had been staring curiously at George Sard. The manager noticed this and said with a smile, "Is anything wrong?" Frank asked in amazement. "Don't you know that your brother Clarence was the ringleader of the gang?" What? "Tonight," Frank went on, "you told him about Joe and me doing undercover work. He came straight here and revealed our identities. If it hadn't been for Captain Nast and my father breaking in when they did, we might have been killed." George Sard turned white and became so weak that he had to sit down. Shaking, he said, "I invited Clarence over to dinner. He seemed very nervous. When I asked him what was the matter, he said he was concerned about the stolen molds. I told him to stop worrying. Mr. Matt had hired a famous detective, Fenton Hardy, and he would find the molds. He had brought his 2 boys, Frank and Joe, to help him." George Sard sighed. "Believe me, fellows, I never in the world had any inkling my brother was involved in the theft." Upon arraignment in court the next morning, the prisoners pleaded guilty to the charges filed against them by the district attorney. After court, the Hardys and Captain Nast went to a nearby restaurant for lunch. The Dover police officer expressed his appreciation for the Hardys' work. To Frank and Joe, however, the greatest praise came from their father, who said, "Boys, you followed the rules of undercover work, in this case to perfection. Congratulations." Well, that was cute. When is this book from? It's from... Copyright 1972, 1959. So the original was 1959, and then they re-upped the copyright 1970. So obviously not the most woke piece of literature, but it's cute. It's a little heavy-handed with the educational portion of it, I have to say. It's very like, yes, this is how you do this part of detective work. It's very heavy on the exposition, we'll say, but still cute. All right, let's see if we can get through a second one. Chapter 2, The Clue of the Cashbox, Fingerprint Proof. The telephone rang shrilly in the Hardy home. "I'll get it," said Joe. As he hurried into the hall, he called back to his brother, "Frank, get out the fingerprint kit so we can show it to Chet." Chet Morton, the Hardys' closest friend, had asked them to teach him the science of fingerprinting. Joe picked up the phone. "Joe Hardy speaking." "Oh, hey Dad, how are you coming along on the New York case?" "I expect to be in Bayport later tomorrow," his father replied, "but before I get back, there's an important job I want you and Frank to do for me. Dr. Gladstone just called from the Bayport at the request of Chief Colleague to arrange for processing a crime scene." "I see, Dad," broke in Joe. "He called you here. He sounded very worried, so I gave him the number of your hotel in New York." "He was upset," replied the detective. "His office was burglarized, and $2,700 in cash was stolen. I spoke to Chief Colleague, and he told me the Bayport police are holding a suspect, but they haven't located the stolen money. What do you want Frank and me to do, Dad? Locate, photograph, and lift fingerprints at the scene. As you know, one of Chief Colleague's fingerprints experts is here with me to testify on the case, and the other one is in the hospital with a broken wrist. That leaves the chief really short-handed, doesn't it? Yeah, call him right away. He's expecting to hear from you. As soon as Mr. Hardy had hung up, Joe dialed Bayport Police Headquarters, because this is the 70s and you can just deputize your teenage sons. That's the thing. The chief said he would send a car to take the boys to the scene of the burglary. I'm leaving for Dr. Gladstone's now, and I'll meet you there, he added. Frank came downstairs with a fingerprint kit and a camera, just as Joe put the phone back in its cradle. He also carried a small black box. Boy, are we in luck, Joe said. Now Chet can see how a real case is handled. He told them about the theft and added, a police car will be here shortly. While we're waiting, will you show me the equipment, Chet said. Sure, Frank replied. This is an investigator's camera, sometimes called a press camera. It can be adapted to take pictures in a 1-to-1 ratio of visible and dusted latent fingerprints. Can you use other cameras too? Chet asked. Yeah, however, most police departments use either the investigator's camera or one made especially for this work, commonly called a fingerprint camera. What's the difference? Well, the investigator's camera is more widely used because it can be employed in many other areas of police work as well as... Oh, Chet interrupted. Here comes the police car. But the black sedan he had seen approaching the Hardy residence continued down the street. Joe took the camera and removed it from its case. He opened the front and extended the lens. Then he produced an angular, tapering sheet metal trough with a ring feature attached to the small end. You see, Chet, he said, the ring fits over the lens housing. He pointed to 3 screws protruding from the ring and added, the trough is fastened to the place with these. And what do you need this contraption for? Chet wanted to know. It's an adapter. It permits us to focus the camera so that a fingerprint will photograph in its original size. I see. This makes it easier for the expert, who will compare fingerprint photos with inked prints appearing on an arrest fingerprint card. It also helps in preparing comparable enlargements for use in court. I understand, Chet nodded. Now, tell me about the fingerprint camera. Well, its use, Joe said, is basically limited to fingerprint work and photographing signatures on forged checks and documents. It's meant to be used on flat surfaces. Otherwise, distortions occur due to improper focus. Frank put in, let me explain the construction of the fingerprint camera to Chet. It's essentially a compartmented box with a predetermined focal depth, which produces only a 1-to-1 reproduction of the subject. In other words, you don't need an adapter? Right. The shutter is manually operated, and the exposure time is determined by the operator's manipulation of the shutter. There's no lens adjustment. The camera is equipped with batteries and/or an extension cord, which can be plugged into a wall outlet to provide power for the built-in electric light bulb, by which variations in lighting and cross-lighting might be obtained. You know this book is from the 70s, because they're not using digital cameras. Yes, this is live. Thank you. I try to be as soothing as possible here on A Book at Bedtime. However, Frank went on, because of limitations Joe mentioned, many police departments believe the cost of such a specialized camera isn't really justified when the investigator's camera can be adapted to do the same job. That makes sense, Chet commented. Frank carried on with the explanation. In most cases, the investigator's camera will photograph a large area, and minor adjustments in focus and lighting can be made when the photographing latent fingerprints on a curved or irregular surface. It can be used in other routine police work, accident investigations, photographing crime scenes, taking mug shots of an arrested person. Chet asked, talking about latent fingerprints, you say you dust them to make them visible? Correct. There are many different colored powders on the market, but Dad says that only the black and gray ones have real practical value. You use whatever powder gives you the best contrast, depending on the color of the object. Incidentally, the powder also comes in aerosol cans and can be sprayed over latent prints. Furthermore, wait a minute, interject Joe. You haven't explained yet why we use the powders. Okay, well, Chet, all fingerprint impressions and footprints are made by ridges which appear only on the palmar areas of the hands and the soles of the feet. Fingerprints are markings left on objects touched by the ridges around on the bulb of each finger. He added that fingerprint experts can actually make an identification by comparing rigid detail left at a crime scene with an ink suppression of the same ridges.
hand, or foot, taken with an inked impression of the same ridges taken either from the suspect's hand or foot. Fingerprints are left, Joe took up the explanation, because of tiny ducts which emit an oily substance. It's really sweat, and every time the hand or the foot touches something, a little is left on the object. Frank added that there are a few persons in the world who do not leave latent prints. They're called non-secretors because they don't perspire. Most people do, however, and generally young persons perspire more freely and therefore leave stronger prints than older persons. The more excited or emotional they get, the more they perspire, and the stronger their prints are. I'm learning fast, said Chet. Now, what about the visible print? That's made by an individual who has his fingers in material like paint, blood, grease, ink, or other similar substances, Joe said. There's one thing I forgot to say about latent prints, Frank put in. They're hard to locate. The best way is to shine a flashlight over the surface at an angle. What's in this kit? Chet inquired. Frank opened the lid. We call this the Hardy Fingerprint Kit, he said. Joe and I assembled it. Chet noted that it contained a long-handled magnifying glass, a small 2-cell flashlight, jars of black and gray powder, 2 camel's hair brushes, a supply of black and white rubberized lifting tape, transparent lifting tape, and a backup card for the transparent and backup cards for the transparent tape. Scissors for cutting the tape to the proper size were also in the kit. Joe said, the rubberized tape usually comes in sheets 4 by 8 inches and is similar to the tape used to repair bicycle tire punctures. One side of it is covered with a sticky substance, and over it is a transparent plastic layer. Now, wait a minute, Chet interrupted. What do you need that stuff for? I'll get to that. Let's go step by step. Joe explained further. So 1, the powder is dusted on an area thought to contain latent fingerprints. Step 2, the prints are made visible. Step 3, the prints are photographed. Step 4, the plastic cover on the rubber tape is removed and the tape is firmly pressed over the dusted print. Step 5, the tape is peeled off, bringing with it the powder. Step 6, the plastic cover is then replaced to seal the powder on the tape. This prevents it becoming smudged and at the same time permits the latent impression to be visible. Chet had a question. Do you always use powder on all surfaces? No, Frank answered. Actually, there are 2 types of surfaces, porous and non-porous. On the porous, like unglazed paper, rough cardboard, and unfinished wood, the perspiration is absorbed and little powder will stick. The prints must then be developed by a chemical process. The most useful methods are iodine fuming and the application of silver nitrite solution. Oil in the print absorbs the iodine, but the mark must be photographed at once because it fades quickly. Silver nitrate combines with the salt in perspiration, which is left along with the print, to form silver chloride. That substance darkens under strong light. Dusting is still the most common method for non-porous surfaces, however, Joe put in, because the equipment is the easiest to carry around. Frank had just started to tell how the powder is placed on a print with a camel's hair brush when the police sedan came to a stop in front of the house. The 3 boys hurried to the car. Officer Con Riley was at the wheel. Frank slid in beside him while Joe and Chet jumped into the back seat. As they drove off, Riley remarked, Looks as if this is an open and shut case, boys. We caught the man who seems to be the burglar. Frank asked why the police suspected the man they had picked up. Riley chuckled. Well, we have some pretty good circumstantial evidence. Circumstantial isn't enough. Bill Adams saw the guy running away from Doc's house with Jimmy in his hand. We caught him going into the woods about a quarter of a mile away. And the money? Joe asked. Riley frowned as he turned the corner. That's one thing that's puzzled us. We have looked for it everywhere, no luck. The car pulled up to the curb in front of a large, old-fashioned brownstone house. Frank and Joe hopped out, followed by Riley and Chet. After climbing a flight of stone steps, they entered Dr. Gladstone's office. There they were greeted by Chief Colleague, who got to the point quickly. We have a suspect in the next room. He'll be booked for possession of burglary tools, but he insists he didn't steal any money from Doc's house. My men have taken photographs of the jimmied window and the cash box. That's where all the money was. With a thumb, he indicated the metal box on the table. Did anyone here touch anything in the room? Only Dr. Gladstone. He used the phone to call us, Colleague replied. Otherwise, there hasn't been a soul in this room that we know of for a week, until Dr. Gladstone came in this morning after a 7-day illness. Whoever left prints on the table, the window, and the cash box is the one who stole the money. Joe said, Okay, Chief. We'll get to work. The Hardys picked up their fingerprint kit. and started from the room, calling to Chet to join them. The boy looked puzzled. "Hey, what are you going outside for?" Joe explained that trained criminal investigators learned long ago that the best way to find latent prints is by trying to put themselves in the burglar's place, mentally and physically. "We're pretty sure the thief entered the office by the window," Joe said, "so we'll check for the outside of the sill, the panes, and the ledge for latent prints." Frank and Joe found that the window was not far above ground. They squinted at the glass from various angles in order to get a clearer view. Chet looked too and suddenly exclaimed, "I see a print." He pointed to a darkish spot. Frank shook his head. "That's only a smudge, Chet." He explained that a smudge is a smear of a print, with no identifiable ridge pattern. "Oh," said Chet, disappointed. He was about to touch the window when Frank warned, "Stop! You're violating the cardinal rule of preserving evidence. Many times people accidentally spoil latent fingerprints this way." "Sorry," Chet said. Frank studied the window carefully and then said excitedly, "There are lots of prints along the bottom of the sill and the sash, and there are some beauties on the glass. I'll dust first, and then we'll photograph them before lifting them." "That's what I want to see," Chet said. "Well, watch me here," Frank suggested. He pointed to the portion of the window about midway in the frame. "On glass, which is not backed up by any colored object on the other side," he said, "we can use either the gray or the black powder for our lift. But before we take a picture, we must back up the print by white paper if we use black powder, or by black paper if we use gray powder." Frank dusted the prints with gray powder. Then, while Officer Riley held a large black backup card inside the window, he photographed the first print. Chet craned closer to watch. He noticed that Officer Riley had scotch-taped a small slip of paper to one corner of the backup card, bearing Frank's initials, the date, and the numeral 1. Before Frank took the next shot, Riley changed it to numeral 2. "Why is he numbering the pictures?" Chet asked Frank. "Because the investigator has to make notes about the crime scene processing and all evidence located so that it can be properly presented in court," Frank explained. "Sometimes evidence is collected which can never be used in court simply because it wasn't put together properly or was not maintained correctly. In some cases, a police officer can't testify effectively due to incomplete notes." "I see. So, in other words, you have to be very systematic." "Right. Now let's lift the fingerprints." Joe trimmed a piece about 1.5 inches square from the sheet of rubber tape and removed the plastic covering from the sticky side. He handed the tape to Frank, who applied it over the first latent print. "You see, Chet," he said, "I put one end of the tape down and roll the rest across the print. This way I get a nice smooth lift." He peeled the tape off carefully and replaced the transparent plastic covering over it. Then he initialed, dated, and numbered the back of the tape, just as Riley had done with the photographs, before going to work on the next print. When all the latent prints were lifted, the Hardys gathered up their equipment and Frank said, "We'll go inside now." They went into the physician's office to search for more latent prints. 3 were discovered on the side of the window frame. Their next job was the desk. The Cashbox was in the right-hand drawer, Chief Colleague told them. "Chet, try your luck and see what you can find," Frank suggested. "Me?" "Sure, why not?" There are so many reasons not to let your random friend. Just, sure, why not? Chet beamed Frank's flashlight obliquely on the surface of the desk. Suddenly, he yelled triumphantly, "Here are a whole bunch of prints." Chief Colleague and the Hardys came closer and took turns peering through the magnifying glass at the maze of patterns. "Sorry, Chet," Frank said quietly, "but they're all smudges except this one." He placed a white chalk ring around the one he had pointed out. Seeing how crestfallen Chet was, he added, "Go ahead, dust it." Chet selected the grayish powder for contrast and dusted it on lightly. Slowly, the ridges appeared. He stepped back and gazed admiringly at his handiwork. "Now take the camera," Frank told him. "I've already focused it and set the lens opening and shutter speed for the film we're using. Put the end of the adapter trowel firmly on the desk, and don't forget to number your pictures." Frank watched while Chet followed his instructions. "Perfect," he said. "Next, you trip the shutter without moving the camera. Always remember to take 2 or 3 shots and to advance the film after each exposure." Wow, this is a throwback. I was terrible for that, for advancing the film. When Chet had finished photographing the print, Frank asked him to lift it. Chet selected the black tape to contrast against the gray powder and did as he was told. "Good work," Chief Colleague commented. "Now tackle the table and the cash box." Frank and Joe flashed their lights on the table and looked disappointed. Nothing but smudges, Joe murmured. Right, Frank agreed. Well, let's try the Cashbox. They scrutinized the small green metal container on the table, its lid jimmied open. Several papers were strewn nearby. At that moment, Chet looked up to see an elderly, bespectacled man entering the office. Fellows, here's Dr. Gladstone, he announced. How are you, Doctor? Frank said, recognizing the physicians. Too bad about this. Were these papers in the Cashbox? Yes, Dr. Gladstone said sadly. That's all the burglar left. Joe spoke up. Were you the one who discovered the theft, and has there been anyone else in the room today? Well, I was coming down the stairs when I heard a noise. I opened the door with my key, and I noticed that the side window was open. It was then that I saw the rifled box on the table and called the police. I didn't touch anything else in the room except for the phone. The doctor turned to speak to the chief. Meanwhile, the Hardys located several good prints on the Cashbox, which they dusted, photographed, and lifted. Now what? Chet queried. We'll take the prints of the suspect. Okay, Chief? Frank said. Bring the kit, Joe. At a nod from colleague, everyone went into the waiting room. A dejected-looking small man with furtive eyes sat on an old-fashioned straight-backed chair, guarded by a husky policeman. The suspect watched worriedly as Joe set down a small black box the boys had brought along. They called this the Hardy Fingerprint Recording Kit. It contained a tube of printer's black ink, a small rectangular piece of clear plate glass, a rubber roller, a metal fingerprint card holder, a jar of gasoline, some paper towels, and a number of FBI standard fingerprint cards. Frank placed a few dabs of ink on the plate glass slab and with the roller spread it over the surface. Noticing Chet was watching intently, he said, We rolled the ink just enough so that we can get a smooth coat on the fingertips. A good way to know if we have too much or too little is to hold the glass up to the light. If there's a light brown film, it's okay. Meanwhile, Joe got out the FBI standard fingerprint cards. Chief Colleague began asking the suspect questions in order to fill in the required data. When the man gave his name as Jed Silvers, the police advised him of his constitutional rights to consult a lawyer before making any statements. Then the chief said, You're from Redmont, aren't you? Yes. Didn't you get out of jail only last week? Yes. Turning to Frank, Chief Colleague said, He's a petty larceny crook who's always in and out of jail. While the chief continued to fill out this card, Joe said to Chet, Take a look at this. The standard FBI card has spaces for two types of impressions involving the fingerprinting. In the upper 10 spaces, the prints of each finger are taken separately. These are known as rolled impressions. At the bottom of the card, prints of the 4 fingers of each hand are taken at the same time, and then the 2 thumbs are printed together. These prints are called plain impressions. Joe picked up the card that Chief Colleague had completed and clamped it firmly on the desk, with the metal holder from the kit to prevent it from slipping. He then asked Silvers to clean his hands with the gasoline by rubbing them together. For the cleaning job, he said to Chet, you can use alcohol or benzene, anything you have available. Joe gave Silvers a paper towel to dry his hands. Standing at the man's right side, he took Silvers' right hand and inked the thumb from tip to below the first joint by rolling it lightly from right to left on the inking plate. Then he rolled it onto the fingerprint card at the same time. Then he rolled it onto the fingerprint card in the same direction. You roll each finger only once, he explained to Chet, and you print the fingers separately, beginning with the with the right thumb and then index, middle, ring, and little finger. As Joe proceeded, Chet noticed that the contrary to the thumb, the fingers were rolled to the left. As Joe proceeded, Chet noticed that, contrary to the thumb, the fingers were rolled from the left to their right side or away from the suspect's body. Do you think you could do the same with his other hand? Joe asked. Chet, I'd like to try. Who's just letting this guy just try out fingerprinting on this petty larceny crook suspect? What could go wrong? Here again, the thumb is rolled towards his body, but the fingers are rolled away from his body. Do I stand on his left side or his right? He's right there! He's hearing all of this. Whichever you prefer. Chet accomplished his job with a proud grin. Great work, pal, Frank said. Now, in order to complete this card, we'll record Silver's plain impressions. The 4 fingers of the right hand were inked and then pressed simultaneously on the space designated. When the left hand was completed, both thumbs were inked and printed together. Why do you need both rolled and planed impressions? Chet asked.
Rolled impressions are better because the pattern area is usually completely visible. The technician whose job it is to classify the prints uses the plain impressions as a check on the sequence of the rolled impressions. In other words, it is positive proof that the proper fingers were put in the correct spaces. Chief Colleague interrupted. Look, boys, we must make 5 complete sets of cards for the various law enforcement agents. Let's get going. They rapidly completed the task. Then the Hardys compared Silver's fingerprints with the latent prints they had found. Surprise registered on their face. Finally, Joe blurted, Chief, the prints on the windowsill and the sill are identical with Silver's, but unless I'm mistaken, the ones on the desk in the cash box belong to someone else. What? Colleague declared in amazement. I told you I didn't take the money, Silver shouted, but you wouldn't believe me. Maybe you didn't take the money, but you sure did jimmy the window, Joe said. You didn't have time to steal anything because you were scared off when Dr. Gladstone came down here. Isn't that the truth? Silvers hung his head in silent confession. Just then, Frank recalled a family scandal involving the doctor's nephew. On a hunch, he asked, Dr. Gladstone, was your nephew Don here recently? Yes, the doctor replied haltingly. He wanted money, but I ordered him from the house. It was the night I got ill. I don't like to talk about it because, you know, the disgrace he caused my brother when he was involved in that car theft. You don't believe that Don... The man's voice trailed off with the sad realization that his nephew was a prime suspect. Let's go over to headquarters and check these prints against Don Gladstone's in our file, said Chief Colleague. He added, Silvers, you'll be properly charged and held for the court. The whole group went to headquarters and Colleague requested that the card with Don Gladstone's prints be brought to his office immediately. They compared the impressions on the card with the lifted prints from the cash box. They were identical. This clinches the case, Frank exclaimed. Don Gladstone stole the money, not Silver's. You still have to have an expert look at them. You're not fingerprint experts, boys. The doctor, saddened by the results, nevertheless congratulated the Hardys. Chief Colleague thanked them, saying, When your father returns tomorrow, he'll be surprised to find the case solved. You boys did a real professional job. Frank and Joe grinned with pride, and Chet beamed. I never thought I could learn fingerprinting so quickly. When's our next case, fellows? You have been listening to A Book at Bedtime, a Story Ranger Presents production. Tonight we have been taking a page out of the history books and reading The Hardy Boys Detective Handbook by Franklin W. Dixon. You can find ways to support the channel down below. Any of my public domain episodes will eventually make their way over onto youtube.com/storyranger. Support me financially on patreon.com@storyranger or on Redbubble @storyranger. And you can always chat with me forever and always over on Twitter @storyranger. Have a great rest of your week. If you're Canadian, I hope you had a good Canada Day, and I hope you also spent some part of it remembering the people who came before on the land that we are lucky to work, play, and live on. I'm talking about the First Nations, the Indigenous peoples of Canada, the Inuit, the Métis. And if you are American, I will see you on July 4th. Wait, will I? No, I won't. So enjoy July 4th, and remember, Black Lives Matter, trans lives are human lives. And yeah. Cool. I'm gonna go eat ice cream cake. Bye!